I'm going to call the work session to order at 7:10 p.m. on Tuesday, June 9th. And number one on the agenda is the short-term rentals, a recommendation to council. Mr. Anderson, would you like to tell us what this is all about?
Yes, thank you. I'd be happy to. This is a proposed zoning amendment, and all zoning amendments go through the Planning Commission first for recommendation. It's the City Council that actually enacts them through the passage of an ordinance. As most of you are probably familiar, there are services such as Airbnb that are relatively new in the past few years that provide an internet platform to match up people that want to rent out all or part of their home, and with people who are looking for a place to stay. And the stays are anywhere from 1 day on up, but mostly short-term stays. So if you're vacationing in Washington, D.C., and this adds to your choices as far as places to stay, along with the usual hotels and motels. So when this came about, it created a little bit of a zoning issue for a lot of communities, because it was introducing a business use into residential areas, but without necessarily changing the residential nature of the home where it was taking place. These are still houses. They weren't being converted into, say, retail spaces. And so one way to look at it would be to just consider somebody doing short-term rental or Airbnb as simply residential as they've always been. We were prompted to take a second look at this earlier in the year when we had some issues that arose from property that was basically only being rented for Airbnb. There was nobody that was living there. The owner had purchased the property and done some renovations for it, had it up for sale. And apparently this is a way to help carry the property and cover some of the costs while it was on the market. The house was offered for rent, the entire house. It's a 4 or 5 bedroom house. So actually quite a few people under good circumstances. What actually happened, though, was it got rented a couple of times, more than once, for a house party, large house party. The person renting it arranged to have it over the weekend and invited their friends, probably invited their friends' friends, and so on and so on. And it created quite a disturbance. In fact, enough that on one of the occasions, 4 police units had to respond to break up the party. And on a second occasion, 8 police units had to respond. So these were not small parties, and they were not small disturbances. Neighbors reported things like getting their flowers and landscaping trampled, litter on the property, driveways blocked by cars, cars parked illegally, all the legal spaces on the street taken up. That, along with the noise, it just wasn't a good situation. And I think, understandably, the neighbors were wanting to know why this could happen on their street. So they approached City Council in February, and the council then directed City Manager and myself to take a look at the issue and come up with a proposed remedy. We did do that and looked at some ordinances. It turns out that the ordinance that the City of Cincinnati has is considered something of a model for other ordinances across the country. And what Cincinnati had, in the context of having probably hundreds of properties that were already in use as Airbnb rentals, was a system of licenses and registration, and then the city imposed a tax on the revenues that they got Airbnb to agree to collect on their behalf. Along with that were some rules. And what we found in our research is that this problem of renters becoming a nuisance in the short-term rental world is not uncommon at all. And even Airbnb, in their training materials for potential Airbnb landlords, they warn people about this possibility and things that they could do to make sure that it didn't become a problem for the area that they were in. In looking at our situation, we had the Airbnb listing that had been a problem, a demonstrated problem. And we had, at the time, 2 other listings in the city, and that's out of about 5,500 single-family units that we have. So you're talking far less than 1%, and there just did not seem to be a lot of supply or demand for this product, this range. In looking at that, if you look at the geography of Forest Park and the housing stock, we are what I would say are conveniently close to a number of metropolitan attractions. Okay, you can get to Kings Island, you can get downtown, you can get to the hospitals, the zoo, all of that within, say, 20 or 30 minutes. Most people, though, that are visiting and visiting for a particular purpose, if they're visiting to, say, go to a series with the Reds down at Great American Ballpark, don't necessarily want to be 30 minutes out. And so the clusters of Airbnb listings tended to be right in the vicinity of those areas, even within walking distance. So you had them downtown and over the Rhine, Clifton, Mount Adams, and places like that. And the other thing that tends to make an Airbnb listing attractive is if the home itself has some unique features. So it may be a historic townhouse or a loft or something like that, something that would attract a person who is looking for a different kind of living experience than a hotel or necessarily the house that they're coming from back at home. And while we have a lot of great family housing here, it doesn't necessarily exhibit those unique characteristics. So those are the 2 things that I think are kind of sort of baked in the cake that we're probably not going to get a lot of the Airbnb type listings or rentals where it's a business traveler or somebody that is going to go to museums or somebody that has a relative at the hospitals. Mercy Hospital is nearby to us, but the main core of, especially when people come from out of town, Children's Hospital, for example, that's down in the uptown area. So all in all, what we were probably more likely to get, though, was this sort of party house. And that's the nuisance that we are trying to avoid, because it really can't be mitigated once it happens. Once it happens, the flowers are trampled, the streets blocked, the litter's on the ground. So we want to prevent that rather than deal with it afterwards. And so in looking over that, city manager and we decided that probably the best and simplest way to deal with this would be to essentially prohibit short-term rental, meaning and transient rental of 30 days or less. And I'll explain the reasoning behind that real quickly. 30 days is a dividing line for rental in the state of Ohio. And when you're at less than 30 days, you're basically falling under what they call the innkeeper laws. And those are the regulations that apply to hotels and motels. They need to keep a guest register. They have to provide housekeeping and linen service. They have to provide you with a secure place for valuables, and some other things. They can't. There's a ceiling on what they can charge per night. Although otherwise that fee is negotiable and can be variable, as probably anyone that's stayed in a hotel knows. They can, on the positive side, I would say, in terms of regulation, if they have a problem guest, they can just lock them out. They get someone that doesn't pay, they can boot them and bring in the police to boot them. Don't have to go to court, don't have to file an eviction, none of that. You're staying as basically a guest of the property. When you go above 30 days, you're into what they call the landlord-tenant laws. And those have some protections for the person who is paying the rent, meaning the tenant. They have what is known as possession of the premises. So they enjoy the same sort of security in your home as an owner-occupant does, with a few small caveats. The landlord can inspect the property, but they have to provide 24 hours notice and make reasonable accommodation if the person can't be home, for example, if they're out of town. They can't just go into the property. They can't shut off utilities. They really just can't mess with your occupation of the property if you're a tenant. And the tenant, if they feel that the landlord is not fulfilling their part of the lease, meaning like they're not making repairs or that sort of thing, the tenant they have a remedy called rent escrow that can deny the landlord some of the rent until that is paid. Until that is repaired. One of the other differences is that some of the maintenance for the property, any kind of general maintenance, cleaning, for single-family houses, it usually includes lawn mowing. That's the responsibility of the tenant. So you don't get a housekeeper, you don't get linen service. And this is all pretty common sense. I think everyone's familiar with how these things work. But it does, what it does is it provides for some people who don't necessarily want to go through all the legal hoops that sometimes that a landlord must do. The prospect of being an innkeeper is a little more appealing when they're looking at making some money off the property. So that's the 30-day. That's a 30-day division. It's well established in the state of Ohio. For our zoning, we have a category called lodging, and that includes hotels, motels, guest houses, and bed and breakfasts, the traditional kind that are full-time bed and breakfast. And we classify that as a commercial use. We allow it in our highway service zone, our planned business district, and our special planning area district. All business districts, not neighborhoods. So what we concluded was that the Airbnb arrangement really falls under the hotel, motel, lodging umbrella, and as such would not be allowed in our residential areas. But we did feel that we needed to clearly state that, because again, it is a bit of a gray area, because really the primary use of the home, especially if the homeowner is owner occupant and they're living in the house while renting it, that situation in particular, they have a good argument for saying that no, the primary use of this is residential, and this is just a sort of accessory or secondary use. So we originally proposed to classify it as a prohibited use, define it as 30 days or less, and leave it at that. And we first discussed it with the city council at a work session that was in person. It was long ago enough for that it was before all the quarantines that we've had recently. And the mayor can correct me if I'm wrong or misremembering, but the council, I think, was definitely wanting to do something, but they weren't all necessarily in favor of banning it altogether. Meaning that a couple of council members had stayed with Airbnb, found it useful, thought that it might be something that some Forest Park residents might want to do and could do without an issue. And so we had a discussion of whether we should adopt a Cincinnati-style licensing and inspection system. And I did recommend against that, partly because our numbers are so few, but also, candidly, because I felt that it created a presumption that it would be approved. So that, for example, the problem landlady that we had, if we had that system in place, could probably have just turned around and obtained a license, maybe paid a fine for getting it late. But then there she is with a license to do the Airbnb, and we still have the problem. So I'll stop here and ask if there's any questions in that summary, if that's clear to everybody, of like where we were and how we got to where we are now. I'm going to jump ahead now to the public hearing that we held with the City Council about 2 weeks ago, or almost 3 weeks ago. And we had a couple of residents who spoke at the public hearing, four. And basic comments were that, if you're looking at innovations and things like that, it's probably not a good idea to, number one, try to legislate based off of one case. But secondly, that these are some things that people might find mutually beneficial, make those arrangements, not cause any problems, not even necessarily come to the attention of the city. And after some discussion, the council favored to add that a person who felt that they could be responsible with it and could demonstrate that could apply for a special exception. And so that's where we are now in our recommendation. For the single family districts, R1 and R2, we're proposing to classify it as a special exception. And that would be the same as the other ones that the Planning Commission reviews from time to time. They would come to Planning Commission, they would have their plan, business plan, floor plan, that sort of thing. And then they would have to show how they would meet the conditions of the special exception. And some of them are quite applicable to this situation, particularly the requirement that it not create nuisance conditions. And specifically, nuisance conditions regarding noise, nuisance conditions regarding litter. And of course, the Planning Commission can dive even further into that and with conditions regarding parking, for example. The other part of the special exception is that they fit within the area that they are located. And so we can take a look and see, because one house may be appropriate for it, another house might not. One street, it may not be a problem to have a few extra cars. There's lots of parking, it's not crowded. Another one, they're struggling to keep up with what they have. So that there's some appeal to that approach. The other thing is that the planning commission can put conditions on approval. And then finally, if a person doesn't perform the way that they promised, that's a revocable approval. So that's the recommendation. It's for amendments to 3 sections that are contained in the ordinance that's attached to my report. Basically, in the single family districts, is prohibited unless you get a special exception. In our multifamily district, it's prohibited without any special exception, meaning that it's just prohibited. And reason for that is our multifamily districts are by and large apartment complexes, professionally managed apartment complexes. They are not in the innkeeper business, and there's no reason for them to want to be. What could happen, though, and does happen in other places, is that you'll get a tenant of the apartment complex then subleasing their unit for Airbnb to make some money, or even to sort of flip the rent. If the rent is $800 a month and they feel like they can bring in $1,000 through Airbnb, then they're making a profit off of that lease. I have no problem with people making a profit, but that's not the purpose of those apartments. And so our apartment, we checked with a couple of apartment complex owners, and they don't have any interest in Airbnb from their standpoint. So we've left it prohibited fully in the PR3 district. That's the recommendation. And I'll just one more comment on this. Normally what would follow this would be the council public hearing. That at the council public hearing, the council would have a commission recommendation. Because of all the problems that we had in terms of organizing things with the building being closed and not being able to meet with more than 10 people, that got a little bit out of order. We had to hold the planning commission on the 18th because we'd advertised it about 6 weeks prior. And the planning commission, we didn't need to meet that month, and we thought it would just be better not to meet. It doesn't present a problem as far as adopting the ordinance, but I just wanted to point out why that happened, because you may have noticed that public hearing would normally come after, not before.
Thank you, Chris. I apologize. I wanted to just set the tone for the meeting when we first started, that during the work session, if there's anybody else online that wants to make comments, there won't be any comments during work session, but there will be comments during the planning commission meeting where we have communications from the public where you can talk about anything that you like to, that's on our agenda. And the other thing is, since we can't have everybody talking at one time, after somebody makes a comment, and that I'll just go down the list of commissioners and ask each commissioner if they have any comments or not. And then after, we'll go down through with Lewis Button first, and then Dennis Smith, and then Chuck Johnson, and Susan Anafuro, and Sherman Bradley. That's the order we'll go in. And then if you get through that order, if anybody else wants to say anything, then I'll come back to that person if we've heard anything, so that everybody gets a chance to make all their comments. So with that, how about if we start with Lewis? Any comments on Mr. Anderson?
No comment.
Okay. Mr. Smith, I don't think he's online with us. And Mayor Johnson?
Yes, as Mr. Anderson said, the council has discussed this. We held there was a public hearing on it. We had asked Mr. Anderson and the city manager to come up with some recommendations to us that we would be allowed, we would get a chance to view, and then we would make a recommendation to council. I would say that council is very satisfied with the recommendation that Mr. Anderson, with the information that Mr. Anderson put together, and the recommendation that he is suggesting the planning commission makes to to the council. We understand and realize that, you know, the world's changed and people are doing a whole lot of different things. But at the same time, we have to be able to maintain, we have to have zoning laws and regulations that we can enforce. Unfortunately, you know, what works in Cincinnati does not necessarily work in Forest Park. They're much bigger. They have a lot more. They have a lot more money in terms of being able to hire people to do enforcement. We don't have that. So what we tried to come up with was something that would say, on the one hand, they're not allowed in these areas, but on the other hand, just like we do with anything else, anybody can come to the planning committee and ask for a special exception, and if they can prove to the planning commission that it's doable based on the requirements of the special exception, and also any other requirements that the plan, restrictions that the planning commission might put on it, are well and good. But at least this does not shut people out altogether. It just says, you know, you have to go and ask for it. And not only that, but it makes it on an individual basis. It's not a blanketed. Some people may have, as Chris says, some people may have homes in areas that would fit, some may not. But by doing it this way, we think we're giving everybody an equal chance. Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Anaforo?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I just need clarification. At the beginning, Chris gave an instance of, you know, a situation that happened. I just need clarification. That was not here in Forest Park, was it?
Yes.
Or it was here?
Yeah.
The
Yes,
instance.
it was here, Dr. Anaforo. It happened on 2 different occasions in the city of Forest Park.
Oh. Okay. That's the comment I have. I needed clarification.
Okay.
Oh,
Mr.
okay. One more thing. Sorry. When was that? Was that a long time ago?
It would have been the fall or the winter, Chris. I don't have an exact date.
January, February.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bradley? Sherman? Are you there, Sherman?
He's still not, his microphone is still muted. Let me see if I can unmute him.
I'll give a few of my comments while we're waiting for Mr. Mr. Bradley. I agree with what the mayor has said. I think in some cases, you know, we have to be, I think Forest Park has always found itself, you know, trying to be ahead of the curve a little bit before problems get out of hand. We try to make sure that we have the ordinances and things in place so that we're not scrambling in the future. And I think this is a good step forward rather than going, you know, full blown like the city of Cincinnati. I think with the limited amount that is going to happen, a special exception is the way to go. I know there'll probably be comments about, well, if somebody wanted to do it very quickly and rent their house out and put it on there next week, they wouldn't be able to do it. Well, that's true. They would have to wait for a planning commission meeting, which could be, you know, 4 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever it is, before the meeting they could get on the agenda. But then the same would hold true for somebody that was wanting to put a deck up on the back of their house and they needed a building permit. So I don't think that, you know, if you have any idea that you want to do that, then you should come in for the special exception and be ready to go. So I kind of thought what would be some of the arguments, and I thought that might be one of them. And I also thought that anybody that wants a building permit, usually they want it that day if they can get it, but it just doesn't happen like that. So I think Chris and the entire staff did an excellent job putting this together. The research is there. I think it's a good ordinance. It's a strong ordinance, but it also gives the community, if somebody wants to do it and do it right, they can still have the opportunity to do that. Mr. Bradley, are you on yet? Can you hear us?
Mr. Chair, I've got him here on speaker on my phone, so I'm going to put him up to my speaker.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I agree with everything that's been stated so far, and I did read what Connie sent out. I read that and everything, but I had to go on, but I didn't comprehend trying to figure the map. I couldn't figure out, I don't know Whitten Road, but what's that exchange just west of Whitten Road?
He's on the wrong one.
Yeah, I think Mr. Bradley, you're on the next item where we're going to change Bollinger Road name to Versailles Drive.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, we'll put that up on the screen too.
okay.
Okay, do you have any comments about the short-term rentals?
No, I do not.
Okay, does any other commissioner have any comments about the short-term rentals? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to move along to item number 2 in the work session, which portion of Ballinger Road name change to Versailles Drive. Mr. Anderson, if you'd like to give us the information on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. All right. For Sherman Bradley, I'm gonna hang up because we're getting feedback, and you can call me back. Okay. My apologies. Is that it? All right. Can you see? Do you see a screen with the agenda on it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm gonna go down to the map, just because I'm gonna refer to that.
Okay. Got it.
All right. We were contacted by Hamilton County and the folks at Cages, who were working with Ohio Department of Transportation to verify all of the streets and street names in the county. And everything in Forest Park was good as expected, except for there was some confusion about Ballinger Road and the actual path of Ballinger, which led me to do some research. And it turns out that the story has more pieces to it than I first thought. It has what I think is an interesting history. If you go back before 1955, Cameron Road, which we now know is the road that runs basically north-south between Route 4 and Sharon Road, right as you get into Springdale on Sharon, that used to make a right turn and go all the way to Mill Road. And that's the reason that we have, for example, Cameron Park Elementary, that was formerly on the site just off that road. And the C and B and C and D sections are their formal subdivision name is Cameron Park. But it didn't exactly follow today's Sharon Road. It went down what we know as Ballinger Road. And so if you're going along Cameron in your 1953 Buick Skylark, you would be making a right onto what we now know as Sharon Road, and then a left onto what we now know as Ballinger, and then kind of looping back up to the north and then continuing to the west, and where it would end at Mill Road the way it does today. Right after that, and this is right at the founding of Forest Park, the county did some road improvements in the area. They built a couple of essentially bypass routes. One that's over in Springdale that runs just south of a little park there at Cameron. And the old part of Sharon was changed to Glen Sharon. And then Sharon was extended over the former Cameron Road. That was changed to Sharon Road, except right there at Southland where it was on a new alignment. And then developer of Forest Park built Southland, that then ended at the new Sharon Road. So we have a Ballinger Road that kind of loops to the south. And if you're on Sheffield Road coming from Woodlawn, that's where that would end. That's where that ended back in the 60s. And so person driving on that route would have to make a left or a right on Ballinger to get to Sharon or Southland or on points east and west. And then that situation held true for about 10 years. And then Southland Road was extended to join up with Sheffield, and found that they no longer needed Ballinger for that purpose. And there was an interest from the developer of Forest Park of building an apartment complex on that southwest corner. You had the road that ran in the middle, as you can see on the map. So this road got vacated by council. They passed an ordinance and said this is no longer public right of way. The apartment complex got built, but what was left was this about 175 feet of right of way over on the left. And I think that, and from what I can tell, that was left because you did have more than one property there using the road, and that was the former swim club, and then the new apartment complex. Ever since then, the city's had a street sign over by the activity center and apartments where that one stub of road is that says Ballinger, and that's correct. I mean, that's correct. And then the main part of it is that L-shaped portion of the road that runs behind Quinn Chapel. And to add to the confusion, when the apartment complex went in, they created a private street called Versailles Drive. And that essentially was the parking lot. The reason it's a street is because they use Versailles Drive for mailing addresses. So all of the units in there have some house number and then Versailles Drive, and not Sharon or South. And it just so happens that that's how you get to Versailles Drive from the west is you turn on Ballinger and it turns into Versailles without any markings or anything. And then if you take that all the way to Southland, you can get back on Ballinger, but you got to make a turn. So it's just what we found. And I noticed this when I first started working for the city, but it didn't seem like no one was really asking for any change. So what we now have is the county saying, we'd like you to change that. And the reason for that is because it does complicate the routing of 911 calls in the area. And I would also submit that it is a little bit confusing to the traveling public. Probably not a big deal, but it's just, it's not needed anymore. And so the easiest and simplest thing to do is to change that small section of right of way to Versailles Drive. And then in the ordinance, and I'm going to take this back off now. In the ordinance, it contains a section that says basically Versailles Drive is going to stay a private drive where it's a private drive. Where it's public right of way, it'll stay public right of way. Those two can coexist side by side, no problem. But it doesn't obligate the city to start plowing the apartment complex parking lot. We just state that to be 100% clear on that point. But basically what we would do in order to implement this is get a new street sign and post it over there on Sharon Road. And then we have some official maps that we would put that change on those maps as well. So this is another thing that does get implemented by the city council, but all all things related to streets and the connection, especially the connections of streets, are also in the purview of the Planning Commission. So hopefully that makes it clear where we were, where we are, and where we want to go. And be happy to answer any questions on that.
Thanks, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Bunton, any comments?
No comments.
Okay. Mayor Johnson?
No, I'm fine with it.
Okay. Dr. Anaforo?
Yeah, I do have a question. Are there houses on that part of this, on Ballinger? Are there houses there right now?
No, they're not, and there haven't been for 50 years. There is a street in Springdale that connects to it, but there are no addresses. There are no residential addresses or otherwise that use Ballinger Road.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Bradley? I don't think he's on.
He might call me back.
Okay, he shows he's on here, but somehow he must have his mic muted or something. But okay, seems like a very simple procedure here. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay,
So,
I'm putting you on speaker. So we can hear. Yeah.
okay, Mr. Bradley?
Yeah, I don't have any questions.
Okay, thank you. I think it seems pretty, clear cut on this, that it's something that needs to be done. So is there any other comments from the commissioners? Okay, we'll move on to number 3, purchase of 3 vacant residential lots for redevelopment. And this is for informational purposes only. Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, I mainly wanted to share this with the Planning Commission because for those of you that have been on for a few years, these are properties that Rafik came to us with, and where they were in such bad shape and without any responsible party to do anything about them that we ended up demolishing. So this activity mostly took place in 2014. And that's 2 of the properties were demolished at that time. And then more recently, just about 2 years ago, 805 Hillsworth was demolished. So where we are now, we never owned those properties. They've been forfeited because of non-payment of taxes, essentially, and the assessments that are on them. And through the land bank, they've been offered to the city. And the land bank has this is the only entity that has this authority, but they have the authority to zero out or extinguish those taxes and liens. And this is something they do with community development organizations, with municipalities, townships, and the like in Hamilton County. And they charge a simple, flat $1,000 fee for each. And so we're going to have it's an ordinance at the next council meeting to go ahead and purchase those 3 lots. The plan for them is to build a new house on each. We've had people that have had a fair amount of success with that approach, most recently in the C section on Chipley Court. That was somebody that purchased the property directly, didn't have to go through the city, but it was the same result. And the house that was built there, it sold for, I think, $240,000, which is a very good price for Forest Park, and especially for the C section, where most of the houses are smaller now. So we're gonna do that same thing once we gain control of those lots. But wanted to just make you aware that this was happening, and that and hopefully we're gonna have a nice happy ending to the story that started with those demolitions many years ago.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Anderson. Any comments from any of the commissioners on this?
Yeah, just one
I
question.
agree with you. Second is here.
Just one question. Do, do you put the plot on sale? Do you advertise it?
Right, we will probably do a request for proposal. So it won't just be a straight up bidding process. It'll be essentially a bidding and qualifications process. So we'll look to find somebody that has some demonstrated experience and capacity to do what we want. And the other thing that that we'll probably review at the next planning commission meeting is that we would like to put some additional standards that go above and beyond our building and zoning. Just to make sure that the houses that are built are compatible with the surrounding area.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. That sounds good. I noticed that Drees Company are doing a lot of this build on your own lot, and there's a number of other companies, Heilman something, I can't remember, James, I think.
Yeah.
They're doing some building, and possibly that would work out pretty good.
Mhm.
Okay, well, if there's no other comments, somebody's getting a little bit of back feed on, and I think it's coming from Susan.
Yeah.
What?
I think there was a little bit of, there's back feed coming from yours.
It might be the phone.
What does that mean?
Chris, you should be able to mute anybody who's not speaking. They'll cut, yeah. They'll end that, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna call the work session to a close at 7:57 p.m. and open up the Planning Commission meeting. And Connie, if you would please call the roll.
Mr. Johnson,
Here,
Mr. Aronson,
Here.
Dr. Bunton,
Here,
Mr. Bradley,
Here.
Dr. Anaforo,
Yeah,
and Mr. Brown asked to be excused. Mr. Smith is not in attendance.
And I believe Mr. Bradley is on the phone.
yeah, he's here.
No, Mr. Brown.
No, Mr. Brown.
All right. Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would move to excuse Commissioner Brown and Smith.
Okay, is there a second?
I second that.
Okay, it's been moved in second. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Passed unanimously. We'll move to the minutes from the February 3rd, 2020. Has everybody read the minutes, and are there any additions or changes? Hearing none, except the minutes as written. Moving on to commissioners' reports. Dr. Bunton, do you have any report?
No report.
Okay. Mayor Johnson?
I have no report. I just wanted to say I'm glad to see that everybody is hopefully safe, happy, and healthy in terms of this whole pandemic problem.
I agree. Dr. Anaforo?
yes, I just want to say I'm happy to see everybody's okay and see everybody's face.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bradley?
I'm doing great. Everything's okay.
That's good. I'm very happy that we're back again, and it's kind of fun to see everybody's faces. I agree, and I agree with the mayor. I hope everybody is safe and happy and getting through this pandemic, and hopefully we'll get on to bigger and better things. Okay, we'll move right on to the director's report. Mr. Anderson, do you have anything to report?
Thank
You got us muted, Mr. Anderson.
Nothing additional except that We are quite likely, if we have a meeting in July, to also be doing it this way online. It looks like August is the earliest that the kind of public meetings, gatherings, that we'll get that guidance from the state. So we'll see. But if we're going to meet next month, it's going to be online.
Okay, thank you. At this point in time, we're going to go to communications from the public. If addressing the commission, please wait for the chair to recognize you, state your name and address, and please limit comments to 3 to 5 minutes. This meeting will be recorded for ease of transcription and will be broadcast by Waycross Community Media. Is there anybody here that would like to speak from the public? Is there anybody here from the public that would like to speak during the communications from the public? Hearing none, I'm going to close the communications from the public and move on to item number 7, new business. Item number 1, short-term rentals, a recommendation to council.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would like to move to recommend that we draft the ordinance regulating short-term rentals, version dated June 8th, 2020, be adopted by City Council.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Okay, Mr. Bradley, second the motion. It's been moved and second. Is there any other discussion about the motion? Hearing none. Connie, if you would call the roll, please.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Aronson,
Yes.
Dr. Bunton,
Yes.
Mr. Bradley,
Yes.
Dr. Anaforo,
Yes.
Okay, it's been approved unanimously, 5-0, I believe it was.
yes.
Okay, we're moving on to item number 2, portion of Ballinger Road name change to Versailles Drive.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Mayor.
I would move that we accept the recommendation of the director and present to council our recommendation to act on that portion of Bellinger Road name change to Versailles Drive.
Been moved,
Second.
seconded by Dr. Bunton.
Mhm.
Okay, are there any discussion? It's been moved and seconded. Are there any discussions? Hearing none. Connie, if you'd call the roll, please.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Aronson,
Yes.
Dr. Bunton,
Yes.
Mr. Bradley,
Yes.
Dr. Anaforo.
Yes.
Okay, it's been moved and approved 5-0 for item number 2. Is there any other new business to be brought before the commission?
No, Mr. Anderson, just some informational piece for the planet, for the commissioners. All during this pandemic, various members of the city manager, myself, and fire chief, police chief have been doing weekly, sometimes bi-weekly video meetings with the Hamilton County Department of Health, as well as with the governor's office. The lieutenant governors held meetings with the mayors from Hamilton County, well, the mayors across the state, actually. And just last week we had Senator Sherrod Brown. And one of the things that, some of the things that we're looking at in terms of the city, we're probably, as Mr. Anderson stated, we're probably not going to reopen City Hall to the public until the state does something with clarify some of its regulations. Right now, a lot of those regulations are out there, but they're a little bit confusing. I would say an example being the governor, two of the things that are still in place that a lot of people obviously are ignoring is the social distancing, the 6 feet apart, and also one of the things that's still in place is groups of meetings of 10 people or less. And if we held meetings in the city building or in the chambers as we've usually done, I don't, in our opinion right now, we would not be able to allow very many people in. We don't have a lot of people in our meetings anyway, but then for the social distancing part, we would have to arrange ourselves, not behind the dais, but out in the audience part, which would take up more room where the audience people would be. Another thing, just for your information, the same thing kind of applies to senior citizens facilities. Although, according to the governor, you can reopen these places, but those are places where they're suggesting that you don't unless you can meet those guidelines, because us old people are more susceptible to get this disease than anybody else. And as I said, some of these things are quite confusing. In that, for just a quick example, we're allowed to open starting tomorrow, I believe we could open our playground areas for kids, but we can't afford to. Most cities can't, because the regulations require almost a constant cleaning after use. So we aren't sure. Does that mean that every time some kid slides down the slide, before we let another kid slide down, we have to clean it up? So those are some of the kind of things everybody's trying to work through, and at the same time allow people as much freedom of movement as possible. But obviously nobody knows what's going to happen in the fall and the winter. Some of the things that we heard or been told was that this virus, you can have both the flu and the virus at the same time, and not necessarily know which one is which. And if there is, especially in the winter, if there's an upswing of it, we could be right back where we started with places being told that they have to lock down again. But right now, we're just, we're trying to do the best we can and err on the side of safety is basically what the city's trying to do right now.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any other new business or comments?
I got a comment. I want to apologize to Connie and Chris. Oh, this computer got mine. We got a virus. We got the CV. Run them out. Take that out. They did take all.
All right.
Okay. Well, hearing none, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned and look forward to seeing all these smiling faces next month.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Good night.
everybody take care.
Right.